Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Fu. Welcome to our first module, which is the Introduction to Developmental Psychology. Hopefully, this presentation kind of sets the tone and guides you through the first chapter. So, in today's presentation, I'll be asking a few questions, and there's a corresponding handout in your Canvas module. So go ahead and find that if it helps you. But follow along. I'll throw in some questions and a case study and then wrap up a few themes before we go. So I call this the 5-minute free write. Feel free to answer these three or four questions on your own. Think about what makes you who you are. How did you become the person you are today, essentially? What are the various changes that have occurred since birth until now? And what are the changes you anticipate in the future? If you're using the handout to follow along, there's a nice little timeline on it. So I think that for me visually captures all the various changes. So feel free to use that. And then the last question is, what are some of the causes, influences, and contribution to those changes? So I think answering these three questions really helps set the tone of some of the things that we'll talk about through our semester. So feel free to take a few minutes to answer these. So, continuity and discontinuity of development. The way to kind of best think about it is continuous development is small, gradual increments. Development occurs skill by skill, task by task. It's not very noticeable. It's almost like a smooth line. And some of this will make more sense when we go to the next slide. But you're not going to notice a huge shift, even though changes are occurring. So, as opposed to continuous development, discontinuous development, which I like to call stage related development, there's some of the biggest leaps, there's qualitative differences, and we'll talk about some of the theorists like Piaget, Freud, and Erikson. They're all stage theorists. So, some of this will make more clear when we go to the next slide. So, a good example of continuous versus discontinuous development is height. So, when a baby is born, it's a certain size, height, and weight. But by its second birthday, that boy or girl would have doubled its original height. But when we look at the top graph, if you look at height, it really kind of gradually we grow a little bit each year, sometimes more than others, but it seems like a really smooth line, so it looks continuous. Versus the bottom graph, it looks at the changes in height. So instead of looking at your actual height, we're looking at the growth you've had each year. So you can see some of the biggest growth really happens from birth to 2 year old, then that growth kind of tapers off. And it doesn't really pick up until puberty, which makes sense, where teenagers go through a lot more significant growth spurts, their final growth until we hit adulthood. So even though it's the same concept, it's height, you can think about it both as continuous versus discontinuous growth. So I've relisted the questions that we started with today, and I'd encourage you to come back to some of these questions as we go through different lectures and topics throughout the semester to really think and challenge yourself on how your thinking has changed on these various aspects of development. So finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about why learn about child development. Here are the three reasons. Many of us are raising children, and I think it's good to be informed about what helps development, what contributes to it, and it kind of gives parents a guide of what's normal versus not, so they have a sense of direction of where to go. Choosing social policies. So beyond parents, a lot of the decisions that we make in society impacts our children. So how can we use the evidence that we have and make the best out of it? And finally, a lot of us just want to understand human nature. The questions that I've asked about who you are, a lot of them, even if you're not a parent, you've been a kid yourself, or you might be both. You are a parent and you've been a kid at some point in life. So being able to understand where we came from and what caused us to be who we are is fascinating. So, just briefly to go over an example in your book, one of the example they gave is how do we help children to control their anger? Because in the United States, 80% of kindergartner parents have reported occasional spanking, and out of that, 27 of them reported spanking the previous week. So, a lot of parents go to that, and at the same time, we know that spanking isn't really effective. By third grade, I think is what the book has said, the children who have been spanked actually acted out, fought back, and argued a ton more than those who haven't been. So I think an alternative way of thinking about this is how can we help children control their anger, recognize their emotions? Um, so what research has shown us is there's some alternative, letting the children um, feel empathized, feeling, oh, they understand what I'm going through. I'm angry. Being able to label that, give them the words for it, or practice positive alternatives of expressing anger. And I love that image of having children get into the shape of a turtle to kind of self calm, self soothe, and then give them a little bit of space and time. And to be able to do that is probably a much better alternative that's backed up by research than spanking. Again, choosing social policies in your book, it talks a lot about 3 to 5 year old children giving testimonies in court. Um, and a lot of times the question becomes, can we really trust them, especially given how young they are, how does their memory function, but also if they're being asked leading questions, because they can be easily misled if you give them the same repetitive questioning. And if you ask them, are you sure? A lot of times they'll question themselves. So being able to do that research and say, how can we help children give the most accurate testimonies is a sense of helping the justice system carry out its mission through the lens of child development. And finally, understanding human nature. So, there's a section in your book that talks about Romanian orphans that's been adopted in Britain. I'd encourage you to read that. That's a really easy but fascinating read. Depending on when they were adopted, they kind of track the long term impact of being neglected. So, very short, what had happened in Romania is in this orphanage, somehow these children, these babies really, weren't being picked up majority of the day, and they really had physical touch even when they were being fed the bottle, and that seemed to have a huge impact. So depending on when they were adopted again by the British parents, they then tracked these Romanian born children with the British born children. And what they found was the children who were adopted between 6 and 24 months of age had long term negative impact, even though their British parents were very loving, had great environment that should have helped them flourish like other British born children. So you saw a lot of changes like lower weight, lower intellectual development, and that inability to kind of regulate emotions and all that. So being able to understand what really helps individuals thrive and what doesn't really helps us understand how we became who we are and then move forward maybe in a different direction. So hopefully that in a nutshell helps you kind of stay more grounded to the first module, the first chapter. I'd encourage you to read the chapter, especially the parts that fascinate you. But I'll be back with some more next week, and I hope that this kicks off a good start. Don't forget your CLA is due soon, so check Canvas for the specific due dates, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me through either email or Canvas inbox if you have questions. Talk to you guys soon. Take care.